After slavery, they still wanted to control the Negroes' labor. They wanted to direct the type of work Negroes did and where they did it. And to do so, they created these labor contracts, which in many instances were just one step removed from the old time of slavery, right? And they required Negroes to sign on the dotted line, as we shall see as we continue our study from Dr. Leon Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery. Here we go. When the post-war Southern legislatures adopted measures to compel blacks to contract with an employer or face arrest as vagrants, they had merely written into law what the Union Army and the Freedmen's Bureau had already demanded of the freed slaves. Despite the virtual abrogation of the black codes, the contract system remained very much intact. The black codes had been quickly overturned, but the labor contracts, which were similar in nature, were still in full effect. In South Carolina, for example, the Union commander voided the codes but simultaneously ordered freedmen to contract in the next 10 days or leave the plantations on which they lived. The codes had contained clauses which offended Northern standards of justice and fairness, like making unemployed Negroes have to work on forced labor plantations, while not having the same penalties for whites who were also out of work. The contract, on the other hand, was a much venerated instrument of law, which enjoyed high standing both in the North and in the South, embodying as it did a voluntary agreement between two parties, in which the terms and conditions were spelled out. The contract suggested what the codes had not: impartiality, equality before the law, and the traditional American virtues of give and take and compromise. Some of the agreements consisted of the expected behavior, work hours, pay, and the penalties for not keeping consistent with the terms. Federal authorities introduced the contract into wartime labor relations in the South as a way of protecting the newly freed slaves, easing the transition from slave to free labor, and compelling former owners to recognize emancipation and compensate their workers. One of the differences was that the masters were no longer allowed to whip Negroes as a punishment. And on top of that, they also had to finally pay for their labor. Drawn up initially by Union Army officers and Freedmen's Bureau agents, the contract also came to be accepted as the most expedient way to get the blacks back to the fields, to regulate the quality of their labor, and to ensure a stable working force for the highly seasonal agriculture of the South, because they desperately needed blacks back in the field so they could tend the crops, because who else was going to do it, right? So these labor contracts were intended to give the laborers, and more so the employers, some type of peace of mind so the society could get back to business. With often the noblest of intentions, then, the Freedmen's Bureau, from the moment of its inception, urged the ex-slaves to sign contracts, assured them they would be treated fairly, and warned them of the consequences of non-compliance.
Your contracts were explained to you, and their sacredness impressed upon you again and again.
The Bureau Commissioner for Mississippi told the freedmen,
"If you do not have some occupation, you will be treated as vagrants and made to labor on public works."
If you don't sign these labor contracts and get back to work, then you're going to be forced to work, right? That's what he's referring to. The planters were in such perfect agreement about what they expected of their freed black laborers that they often used the same language in the contracts. By affixing his signature to the agreement, the freedman invariably promised to render perfect obedience, to be prompt and faithful in the performance of his duties, and to maintain a proper demeanor, meaning they were still to act as if they were slaves, basically. No back-talking, no being puffed up, no inappropriate tones, and basically following orders promptly as they were given. On the Hayward plantations in South Carolina, the laborers not only recognized the lawful authority of the employer and his agents, but agreed to conduct themselves
in such manner as to gain the goodwill of those to whom we must always look for protection.
There goes that Negro consciousness popping its head out again. It sees itself as inferior to the whites, and only feels comfortable when beneath them. Few employers went so far as the South Carolina planter who bound his blacks to be
strictly as my slaves
in obeying his instructions. Nor did many think it necessary to adopt the proviso which another planter insisted upon, that the freedmen always address him as master, but few would have dissented from the spirit that had inspired such stipulations. It made little difference to H.A. Moore, a South Carolina planter, if his freedmen addressed him and his wife as
Mr. and Mrs. Moore,
or simply as
Massa Maurice and Miss Betty,
but they were always to
speak politely to us,
which was a reasonable expectation. But during this time, speaking to them politely could mean many different things, especially coming from a Southern white, right? What they usually meant by that was acting submissive in an obviously submissive manner. Lest the freedman be in any way tempted to compromise his perfect obedience, most contracts barred him from possessing deadly weapons or ardent spirits. Ardent spirit means alcohol, which many Negroes had picked up the habit of indulging in during slavery. And so the contract stated that Negroes shall not possess the ardent spirits while at work, and the employer reserved the right to enter the freedman's cabin at any time to see what devices and activities they secretly indulged in behind the closed doors. During working hours, moreover, the laborer agreed to have no visitors and to obtain his employer's permission before leaving the plantation for any reason. Numerous contracts required such permission at all times. Now, I can't help but to think that the military got a lot of its tactics from the days of slavery. We had to do the same stuff, right? They could check our rooms at any time, and they would, and we would have to get permission to go a certain distance, even on our days off, right? I was stationed in Camp Pendleton, California, near San Diego, and to go back home to Vegas for the weekend, I needed to get permission. And that place was only about a 5-hour drive away. And so I know the military must have taken a lot of their ways from the days of slavery, because there's just way too many parallels for it to be purely coincidental. In some regions, the freedmen agreed to submit to punishment for contract violations,
our employer being the judge whether we are to be punished or turned off.
but most contracts could not provide corporal punishment for violations, if only because a bureau official might disallow the entire agreement. However, employers did specify fines for any absenteeism, negligence in work, or breakdowns in expected demeanor. It was a fine instead of a whipping like it used to be. For the more serious offenses, like insubordination or desertion, the laborer could be dismissed, thereby forfeiting all or a portion of his wages and crop shares for the year. And some of the whites would have the Negroes working for an entire season, and just before the harvest of the crop was finished, they would create fake charges of insubordination so they didn't have to pay the blacks for all the work that they had done, right? This was a loophole that some whites used to cheat the Negro. To determine how much work a free laborer, as distinct from a slave, should perform each day raised some obvious difficulties, but some enterprising planters and overseers resolved the dilemma by borrowing from past experience. Observe.
There's a heap in humbugging and
A Mississippi overseer advised.
I worked a gang this summer and got as much work out of 'em as I ever did. I just had my leading and I says to him, Sam, I want this your crop out by such a time. Now you go ahead, talk to the and lead 'em off right smart, and I'll give you $25. Then I got up a race and give a few dollars to the men that picked the most cotton till I found out the extent of what each man could pick. Then I required that of him every day, or I docked his wages.
You see the mind games they played on Negroes? Now, this was actually pretty clever because it revealed what Negroes were really capable of doing. Because during this time, it was said that many Negroes were not putting out full effort in working. So this incentive was a slick way to find out what they could do, then hold them to that standard, and then dock their pay if they didn't meet that standard, right? These folks were something else. Precisely because the task and gang systems remained vivid reminders of slavery, both came into growing disrepute after the war. Most contracts stipulated a 6-day work week and a 10 to 12-hour workday, usually from sunrise to sunset, with an hour or more for dinner. The question of time off on Saturday would take on increasing importance in the annual negotiations over a new contract. In numerous instances, however, freedmen affixed their names to contracts which only perpetuated the terms by which they had served as slaves.
Heap of 'em round here. Just works for their victuals and clothes, like they always did.
A South Carolina planter observed.
I reckon they'll all be back where they was in a few years.
Although designed to protect the interests of planters and freedmen alike, the contract in practice gave employers what they had wanted all along, the crucial element of control by which they could bind the ex-slaves for at least a year and compel them to work and maintain proper behavior. Nor did the presence of a Freedmen's Bureau officer necessarily make the contracts any less oppressive. After all, one agent conceded, the objective of the contract was to prevent black laborers from deserting their employers at a critical time in the making of the crop, because a Negro was said to take off during that time. If they didn't like how the employers talked to them, or for any other reason whatsoever, they were said to just take off. And obviously the employers didn't want that to happen, especially when they needed them the most during the harvest. Whatever the initial intent, the contract system embodied that universally accepted dictum that only compulsion and discipline could induce free blacks to work. The philosophy was that those they called blacks were naturally lazy and required the whip or some other form of punishment to get them to work for anything beyond the basic necessities. That's one of the ideas behind the creation of the contracts for them. Unlike the northern worker who entered into a verbal contract with an employer, the black laborer in the post-war South was bound by a legal instrument which not only stipulated objective terms of service, compensation, hours, and duties, but imposed conditions of demeanor and attitude on the laborer and not on the employer. That feature in itself made the question of compliance or non-compliance necessarily arbitrary and revealed the contract as something less than a bilateral agreement between equals. In so many ways, in fact, the new arrangement simply institutionalized the old discipline under the guise of easing the ex-slave's transition to freedom. It was really one step removed from slavery, like we discussed in the beginning. After comparing the regulations under slavery with those which now controlled free labor, the New Orleans Tribune found but few differences.
All the important prohibitions imposed upon the slave are also enforced against the freedman. It is true that the law calls him a freeman, but any white man, subjected to such restrictive and humiliating prohibitions, will certainly call himself a slave.
Once the contract had been prepared, the employer assembled the laborers on his place, most of them his former slaves, explained the terms, and urged them to sign. The response was likely to be mixed, with some freedmen walking back to their quarters only to pack their belongings and take to the road, unwilling to commit their labor and lives to an agreement they could not even read. Which makes sense, doesn't it? Wouldn't you be hesitant to sign something that you couldn't read? And especially if it came from people who had just enslaved you? The very formality, obscure legalisms, and binding nature of the contract provoked skepticism and dismay, even in ex-slaves who fully intended to remain with their former master. In Burke County, Georgia, Willis Benefield would have nothing to do with a contract.
What you want me to sign for? I is free,
he told the man who had owned him as a slave. Nor did the master's explanation that the contract held both of them to their word satisfy him.
If I is already free, I don't need to sign no paper,
he insisted.
If I was working for you and doing for you before I got free, I can do it still if you want me to stay with you.
If he refused to sign a contract, his mother warned him, he might forfeit his pay.
Then I can go somewhere else,
the ex-slave replied. He wasn't with that paper signing thing. He probably didn't know if he was signing his life away to be a slave again or whatever, right? But what he did know for certain is that he wasn't signing that paper. And he said that he would work for the people without a problem. But to put pen to paper, that was out of the question. Rather than objecting to a specific clause, large numbers of freedmen feared that the contract, as a binding legal agreement, compromised their newly won liberties and perhaps even forfeited their rights to the expected distribution of land among them. That's the 40 acres and a mule they believed they were getting, like we talked about in the last commentary. In his section of Virginia, a Union officer reported, the blacks refrained from contracting for any length of time. In his section of Virginia, a Union officer reported, the blacks refrained from contracting for any length of time,
in the expectation of some indefinable but great benefits to be bestowed on them by the government.
Government wasn't going to give out any great benefits back then to the people who actually experienced slavery. just like it's highly unlikely that it's going to give out any great benefits to their descendants who never did, right? But they sure did hope that it would happen, which is understandable for them at that time. Nor would they place any great faith in the employer's assurance that the contract protected their best interests. The freedmen lacked confidence
in the white man's integrity,
and rightfully so. A bureau commissioner in Mississippi concluded, and the suspicion, other agents reported, often extended to
papers of any description in which their former masters are in any way concerned.
Master Henry made the contract? Oh no, you won't catch me signing that. No, sir. Right? That's how some of the Negroes approached it, because they didn't trust it. On Edisto Island, South Carolina, several freedmen declared at a meeting with federal officials that they bore no personal enmity toward their old masters, but they had no desire to contract with men who had once owned and abused them, or even with those who might have treated them reasonably well but in whom they had no confidence. With numbers of ex-slaves refusing to sign contracts, many of them hoping to obtain better terms, the planter class counted heavily on the ultimate weapons of necessity and compulsion. To hasten that moment of decision, federal authorities complied all too readily with the demands of planters that they apprehend black vagrants and cease issuing food rations to freedmen, thereby forcing them to depend once again upon their old masters for daily subsistence. They had all types of strategies and tactics for the Negro. Ironically, that policy accorded with the growing conviction of the Freedmen's Bureau and Northern Freedmen's Aid Societies that to distribute food and clothing among the ex-slaves made them less independent, reduced their incentives to work, and demoralized them.
The most dangerous process through which the Negro goes when he becomes a freedman is that of receiving the gratuities of benevolence in the shape of food and clothing.
A missionary wrote late in 1865,
"If you wish to make them impudent, fault-finding, and lazy, give them clothing and food freely."
Right? Think about that. Once the freedman had to depend upon his bounty, the planter reasoned, he had only to withhold such support to induce his laborers to agree to terms. That proved to be a sound conclusion, though the results were not always gratifying. When Stephen Doane, a South Carolina proprietor, decided to withhold food rations to force his men to abide by a contract, they killed him. This stuff was wild back then, but that's how it went, right? They trapped the Negro with these labor contracts, which acted as a modified version of slavery. And we can see that the whites were doing whatever they could to hang on to control of the Negro's labor, right? They're doing all this after emancipation. They just can't let the Negro be free, right? They got to control the Negro. That's how they're doing things back then. And the contract was just one way to do that. And so hopefully you have gotten something out of this commentary here. Thank you for your time and for your participation. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.